I had a few problems, and I figured the only way to deal with these problems was to disappear. One of the problems was I didn't have any money. So I asked myself, where could a guy go, be totally anonymous, and get somebody else to pay for it? Well, the answer I came up with was pretty brilliant. I figured what I would do would be I would check myself into a drug clinic. And the only trick was I had to convince the people in the drug clinic that I was an addict. So I sat in front of the place in my car and had a couple of beers. And I figured out all the language and all the gestures and moves so that I could give this really convincing performance. And somehow I did. And you fools bought it. And now it's 30 days later, and I've been to a funeral. I've been to about 9 million job interviews. I'm $52,000 in debt. And I got this chip. And I got this startling belief that that I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict.
January 4th, 2025. I am 1 year, 6 months, 555 days sober. 1 year, 6 months, 550 days. I watched Clean and Sober this morning as a sort of tribute to that time. And it really is kind of an early rock bottom film, largely about lies and denial and not being ready. Really, that's the strength of the movie, is that if anybody wanted an example of someone who wasn't ready, but clearly had a problem, this is it. It's harder, I guess, when it doesn't seem as though there's a problem or unmanageability going on. But in Daryl's case, it's very obvious because he has so many and they're very serious problems. And even still, he's completely unwilling to consider that he might be a drug addict. I was thinking of my early sobriety and how odd it is, maybe not odd, but seemingly random, what eventually just took the cake. You know, I'd been trying to stop drinking for a while and found myself unable to stop. Like, I would plan the night before I'm not going to drink anymore, even get rid of the bottles in the house. And it would just happen. I would find a way. And then I had a lot of excuses and rationality. And okay, at least this time it was just one glass or whatever the case may be. There's so many things. And I knew deep down, I think I knew that I couldn't stop myself, but I also had a lot of proof that I had. There were years in between where I didn't drink for a while, and it seemed easy to me because I just decided and then it happened. So obviously I'm capable of doing that, right? If I can stop drinking for 3 years, then how could I have a drinking problem? It stands to reason, it's logical. But then I learned later on that an alcoholic is not a person who can't stop drinking. An alcoholic is a person who can't stop once they start. And I think that's a really important distinction for me because I hear this a lot now. Because in social situations, people drink and it's fine. Um, but I hear a lot of like, well, I only drink on the weekends and I don't have to. I don't have to, but I just socially drink and I do it sometimes. And um, there's all these rationalities that happen, and I watch people say them, and I recognize them in myself, and I do understand that some people are normal, and they can have a drink, and that's it, and they don't order anymore, and they don't want any more. That's not really the person that I'm talking about here. It's the person who's immediately defensive, or if when asked, what if you could never drink again? What if you never had a drink the rest of your life? And they recoil. Or it's like, oh, but no, I would never choose to do that. But it's not like I couldn't. I just don't want to. It's so hard to voluntarily get to a place to hear yourself and identify that as a struggle when it is a struggle. Even as I watched myself pour glasses of champagne in the morning, I didn't think I was an alcoholic. And it's not even that, like, it's not even the act of it, and it's not the time. It's the enslavement that I could not choose not to do that, and that's the point. But that's not what I was focusing on. It's easier to focus on the logistics of the situation and the practicalities of it than it is to say, I can't choose not to do this because I chose this last night. I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't do it, and here I am doing it. In that moment, somehow I still thought that I could choose. I just wasn't. But that isn't the truth. It's that I couldn't. I couldn't. And there are situations in my life since stopping drinking 550 days ago in AA, and according to the 12 steps, they're called character defects, but there's things that come up that are unrelated that have the same hold or hook, right? Like coffee or soda. All of a sudden, I was drinking soda like constantly to get the sugar back in, right? And then I was more recently introduced to coffee, and then I couldn't stop drinking cappuccinos, and it was ridiculous. It was like I would be at a stoplight and I'd be like, I'm gonna go home. I'm not gonna go to Starbucks. And then 2 minutes later, I'm in the drive-through. And it's not that these things, well, alcohol is poison, so that's kind of not defensible as far as nutrition goes, but coffee in itself isn't bad. Soda arguably is, but certainly not as bad as alcohol. But the point is that what defines the thought process is I don't want to do this. I like myself less when I do this, but here I am doing it. It's almost like I can identify this when I watch horror movies, when people are possessed and they get an exorcism and it's gone. It's like, who are you when you're going against your values? Who are you? It's almost like it's something that's pulling you and something that's enticing you that isn't you. I'm reading The Lost Weekend by Charles Jackson right now. And one of the things I really like about it is how intelligent the main character is, how he's able to kind of get outside of himself as Charles Jackson is doing that, as he himself was an alcoholic, trying to write the book to write the character who describes his situation and then get out of himself. And I'm going to read this to you. This is from a book I'm reading called The Recovering by Leslie Jameson. And she's talking about The Lost Weekend, and she's talking about Under the Volcano as being sort of seminal books on alcoholism and depicting the alcoholic. And in Under the Volcano, it's depicting as romantic and sort of a tragic hero. And then The Lost Weekend, like Clean and Sober, is just the person with the problem. So the main character of The Lost Weekend's name is Don. Don helpfully catalogs all the aesthetic failures of his own story. It has no climax or closure. It holds no emotional suspense. He already knows how he will feel after the first drink and after the 10th, how he will feel after he wakes up hungover the next morning, because he has already felt all these ways before. During a particularly embarrassing climactic moment near the end of the book, Don finds himself facing off against a maid, trying to get her to unlock the liquor cabinet, and is overwhelmed by a distinctly literary moment of self-loathing. Melodrama. In all his life, he had never been in any situation so corny, so ham. He felt like an idiot. His taste was offended, his sense of the fitness of things, his deepest intelligence. Don is ashamed not simply of his actions, but of his genre, the fact that his own drinking doesn't amount to anything compelling. It wasn't even decently dramatic or sad or tragic or a shame or comic or ironic or anything else. It was nothing. That's another thing that I think is so interesting in addiction movies when they choose to romanticize the past or to gloss over the behavior of the addict and make it seem kind of horrifying, but also, you know, like, oh, this person just needs to be taken care of, give her a place to sleep and let her sleep it out. Patrick Melrose and The Outrun were kind of like this, where it was just these grand operatic displays of fumbling, but not in a lean and honest way like Clean and Sober is. The way that Keaton plays this feels authentic and real, and his sponsor and Morgan Freeman over at Rehab, Craig, are no nonsense, no BS. And it's one of the only movies I've ever seen in my life that actually feels in the way that Alcoholics Anonymous feels to be in a meeting, to be around people who are trying to get well, how they talk, what they will put up with, what they won't. And it's an excellent movie for that. The way the plot is structured is that Daryl finds himself, well, actually, I'll let Ebert tell you. So this is the beginning of Ebert's review on the film from 1988. The first 2 paragraphs. It's the kind of thing that could happen to anybody. Just plain rotten luck, really. He picks up a woman in a bar and they do some cocaine together. And the next morning when he wakes up, she's dead. She had a heart attack or something. How is it his fault? What happens to the hero of Clean and Sober during the next several weeks of his life is that he decides that although it could have happened to anyone, he doesn't want it to happen to him anymore. The actual process of surrender and recovery is hardly ever the subject of films. So what I think is the strength of the film is that it shows how hard the fight is against admitting powerlessness over anything, much less a substance that feels controllable. And then what it is that makes him turn. Because the movie starts with a dead woman in his bed. He goes to rehab and fails so much that Morgan Freeman's character kicks him out. He then does cocaine again. He wrecks his office. He already embezzled $92,000 from his company. He gets a sponsor and starts trying sort of to work the steps, but you can still tell that he's not in at all. He doesn't think that he has a problem. He just thinks that if he can solve his financial situation, then everything would be okay. And you're thinking, what more do you need? How much more can you take? Why aren't you realizing it? Like, how bad do the stakes have to be? And it's not until his sort of girlfriend, who also is an addict, who also has a tremendous amount of problems, dies snorting coke while she's driving, that suddenly it's like, oh, okay, maybe I need help. The theorist Eve Kayevsky-Sedgwick argues that addiction isn't about the substance so much as, quote, the surplus of mystical properties, unquote, the addict projects onto it, granting the substance the ability to provide consolation, repose, beauty, or energy, can operate only corrosively on the self, thus construed as lack. The more you start to need a thing, whether it's a man or a bottle of wine, the more you are unwittingly convincing yourself you are not enough without it. So in Daryl's case, with cocaine, it seems like more than alcohol, possibly, probably. It's a chemical dependency that is not so much an identity, so much as a survival mechanism. Somebody said one time that whatever addiction a person is moved towards is the solution. It's not the problem. It is their solution to pain, to discomfort, to boredom, what have you. So in order for Daryl to keep on functioning, he kept returning to that source and that energy. It's not until later into the film where Richard comes to his home and they sort of exorcise the home by throwing away all of the alcohol, throwing the pill, like flushing the pills down the toilet, flushing the drugs down the toilet. And he looks in his couch cushions and all the places where a normal person wouldn't even think that someone would hide, similar to Lost Weekend, where there's just bottles everywhere. And then the addict forgets where they put everything, right? It's almost comical. But what this is getting at is the deeper longing for rest, for bliss to be gone. In Under the Volcano, what Leslie writes in The Recovering is that the consul's tragedy is not the tragedy of higher meaning, it's the tragedy of absent meaning. Again, going back to Dawn and Last Weekend, the fact that his suffering might not mean anything at all. Critic Michael Wood calls it a great book about missing grandeur, about the specialized tragedy that lies in the unavailable. Okay, I'm going to start over. This is a great line. A great book about missing grandeur, about the specialized tragedy that lies in the unavailability of the tragedy you want. And perhaps most of all for the artist and the writer and the filmmaker who struggles and is trying to use art as a way to understand that struggle or go through it. The ultimate insult is that the tragedy that comes from addiction and the behavior of addiction is nothing. It's not beautiful and romantic and the source of genius. It's pathetic and it's self-destructive. There's a great line from Under the Volcano where the guy is basically saying he's basically saying that, like, do you realize that while you're battling against death or whatever you imagine you're doing, well, what is mystical in you is being released, or whatever it is you imagine is being released. While you're enjoying all this, do you realize what extraordinary allowances are being made for you by the world, which has to cope with you? That's another thing that's amazing about Clean and Sober is how Karen lets us see, the director lets us see how much damage Daryl is doing to others and how much they're having to change their lives or be inconvenienced and possibly be robbed or stolen from to accommodate his habit. And that's kind of the theme of the Recovering as well, is all these great writers who were drunks. And Stephen King talks about this in On Writing as well, that there's this temptation to see their genius as fueled by alcohol, as that being the way that they get into a state of transcendence. And it's not only that it isn't true, it is anti-true. Alcohol in addiction, alcoholism prevents the person from accessing who they actually are. And I know this to be true, like capital T true, as DFW would say, because when I stopped drinking and I was going through withdrawal, which is not for slackers, I was able to feel things. And I thought that I was a pretty emotional, attuned, expressive person prior. But all of the numbing effects of drinking and all the other different ways that I used to just anesthetize myself, when that was removed, I had to face things. And the level of desperation that I felt in my rock bottom caused me to get help, which is maybe the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, is to ask for help. There's this temptation when drinking that if I get more, everything will fall into place. And I can recognize this in my life now, even with small things like a Dr. Pepper. If I just have a Dr. Pepper in the morning, everything will fall into place. And that seems like such an innocent thought. If I just talk to this person, if I can be in love or have this relationship or whatever, fill in the blank with whatever you value most. The statement of, I can't be without this because I am not enough without it. It's a really, really difficult thought. But thankfully, I did hit bottom on July 4th. Thankfully, I did want to stop. I did see that I couldn't stop. That's the main thing here is like there's a scene in Clean and Sober where Morgan Freeman is talking to him in the bathroom and he's urinating into a cup to make sure he hasn't done drugs. And Morgan says to him, "You don't even know you have a problem, do you? Like, you don't know you have a problem, and you can't do anything until you know that." So at the end, right before the speech that I shared at the beginning, the clip, he's talking with the sponsor, Richard, and Richard says, "Could anybody make you stop, Daryl?" No, nobody but you can. And that's the rub. And it's not just having readiness to say, okay, I want to stop. It's also saying, or perhaps only saying, I cannot stop myself. It's a kind of humility that is humiliating, especially for me, who is well educated, shouldn't have any problems, didn't have a traumatic childhood, etc., whatever, all of these things in my head that try to keep me from getting better. But to say, I can't do it. And you hope that your bottom isn't someone dying in a car crash or you dying in a car crash. But you don't know what it will be, really. And even when Daryl goes to his boss and he's trying to say that he's sorry for taking the money, he can't even be honest at the beginning. Like, he starts to say it and then he keeps lying and lying and lying, and he's standing there lying, and then finally his boss says, "Did you take the money, Daryl? Did you spend it?" Like, just straightforward, blunt. Did you take it? Did you spend it? Did you have an emergency? And Michael Keaton sits in the chair and puts his head on the table, and then he says, "I have a drug problem." Rock bottom leads to a certain desperation where you're begging for anything that might deliver you from your own worst impulses. I would have, and I still feel this way, I will do anything not to drink. And it's not because I'm afraid of what will happen, although I sort of am. It's because it's not me. The person that I am in addiction spirals is not me. And there's no such thing as half surrender. There's no such thing as I can have beer but not wine. There's no such thing as half measures. It's a struggle for self-honesty. And the beginning of recovery is surrender to the impossibility of control. And in the last 5 minutes of the film, that's what Daryl does. I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict. And I have all of these problems, but I've got this chip. And maybe things will be better. I think the temptation, the greatest temptation, and the greatest barrier for me is that I tried at so many times strategies to control my behavior so that my life as an addict, my private life of what I was compulsively doing would blend in with my other life as a person, a member of society, a friend, what have you. Like I was always so obsessed with trying to merge those two things together, but they can't be, right? So then the privacy and the secrecy of the addiction and the habit becomes more and more crucial that no one find out that the extent to which it's going. And I remember reading a book a couple of years ago while I was drinking called Drink, where the writer talks about moving to another town, making promises before friends, making inner resolves, so on and so forth. But the strategies, no matter how strong the conviction were, just curbed the behavior, but would not be able to change the pattern because there is no real humility there, right? We began to recognize that we were powerless, not merely to change some specific situation. We are powerless over an addictive pattern of which any current specific circumstance was just the most recent example. Sobriety, in the easiest way that I can think about it for my own self, is being ready to be free from a whole life of obsession. And not just partially free, not just I want to do this, but not do this. And I'm going to allow myself this little thing because it makes me feel better and it's too hard to give it all up at once. It's door closed, entire readiness. The 12 and 12 says that readiness is without reservation, whatever. Each of us, regardless of individual circumstances, we're willing to go to any lengths, a day at a time, to stay unhooked. This decision was unilateral. And it's not willingness that comes from strength. It's willingness that comes from the certainty of the dire consequences of continuing on. I've also been thinking about a sermon that I heard recently by a pastor named Andrew Gard, who was talking about when an instrument is in the hands of someone who isn't a musician, it is played very differently. So he has his worship leader come up and bring his guitar, and Andrew plays as well as he can, which isn't very good, and then hands it back to the worship leader, and then he plays it beautifully. And Andrew says, it's the same instrument that's being played, same 6 strings, same everything. but it sounds very differently when it's in a musician's hands. And this is sort of where, for me, the higher power comes in, God comes in to the equation for sobriety. Clean and sober doesn't really get at this part of it. And I think they don't emphasize it because it's not really about the steps yet. They haven't gotten to that point. And it is a lot more emphasized of you need to decide when you're ready. You let us know when you're ready. And then everything sort of flows from that. But for me and for the program, the person who has the problem needs external aid. And I certainly did. And that power is God. And when I am played by the wrong hands, I don't sound very good. So then life becomes, how do I avoid situations in which I am not myself? And who even am I without addiction? I honestly didn't think that I would like myself if I didn't drink. Truly, really. And at the beginning, when I was going to meetings, I kept telling myself as I was sitting there, someday you'll have a drink. Maybe it'll be your deathbed, but you're going to do it. Dang it, and I don't care what these people say. And that was kind of comforting for a while to just be like, this isn't forever. I can drink again. I can drink again someday. And that's the case with so many things that I have had to face since then. Other things that pop up where it's like, is this serving me at all? Does this make me like myself? Does this make me like myself? Does this activity end with me happier? And as an addict at the beginning, there is no way to make those choices because I didn't even want to be myself. I didn't want to be with myself. There's a line in, I just watched this movie, The Sunset Limited by Cormac McCarthy, where Tommy Lee Jones and Samuel L. Jackson are talking about God and suicide and the state of the world and essentially nihilism. And Tommy Lee Jones says that he would love to believe in a God who would tell him that when he dies, there's nothing. He was like, I would love for that to be the case. I just want to believe that I don't have to exist anymore. And that drive is so relatable, right? Even outside of addiction, it's like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to see all of this. I'm too intellectual to be content. And what Samuel L. Jackson says is that, like, the afterlife is everlasting life. And for someone who doesn't believe, that seems like hell, right? Everlasting life. Like, please. He tries to step in front of the subway so that he doesn't have to live at all. So sobriety is, in the end, life. Like, choosing to be sober is choosing to want to live. And I am so grateful and freshly committed not to allowing anything to come between me and God's will for my life. I hope Daryl is too. And I hope you are too.
See, one of the things that's going to dictate the altitude of your life is whose arms you're in. It's who are you trusting? Who are you believing in? I love in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, the writer writes, I urge you in view of God's mercy, meaning in full scope of the grace that God has put on your life, to present yourselves as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, for this is your spiritual act of worship. You see, beautiful worship takes place through our lives when the right instrument is in the hands of the right musician. And let me just tell you, you are the right instrument. You are the right instrument. You just might be in the wrong hands, but you're the right instrument.